Thousands of people have signed a petition calling for a royal commission into what researchers say are catastrophic levels of suicide among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Suicide prevention researcher Gerry Georgatos created the petition, addressed to the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and wrote that a royal commission is the only shot we have left at addressing the issue. He joins us now from Perth. Gerry Georgatos, good morning. So tell us about the work you've done in this area over these years.
Good morning, Joe. Thank you. Look, I'm a member of a federally funded project, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Evaluation Project, and that's an ongoing project where we're working towards evaluation tools and what works, what doesn't work. We've also just put together the inaugural Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Conference and, to connect people from the lived experience, the community-driven programs, and cross-sectorally with the stakeholders and government, and it was a huge success. But these are only steps in the right direction. The issues in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander suicides, as you referred to in the prelude, it's a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. We're losing 5.2% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths to suicide. 5.2%, that translates to 1 in 19 of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths a suicide. And we believe that harrowing statistic to be even much more staggering, because that's an underreporting. There are underreporting issues in terms of coronial determination, and it could be as high, and I am very sure it is as high as 10%, so 1 in 10. But either of those from a racialised lens, 1 in 19 or 1 in 10, should be leading to the galvanising of a Royal Commission. A Royal Commission is our best shot, our greatest shot, and without a Royal Commission, without the deep examination of a Royal Commission into the multifactorial intertwined issues, the tragedy will continue. We will not address the tsunami of poverty-related issues and the constancy of traumas that have now been generated from the socioeconomic disadvantage that's acute.
And is it particularly bad in some parts of the country?
It's particularly bad right across the continent. So the statistic I've given you is 1 in 19 across the continent, but the more west we journey across the continent and then the more north we travel, the worse the narrative gets. So in the remote, in the regional, we have some of the world's highest suicide rates. The Kimberley, when we disaggregate, has the nation's highest suicide rate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from that racialised lens. Similarly, so far North Queensland and parts of the top end of the Northern Territory. The Kimberley has the second highest suicide rate from that racialised lens, only behind Greenland's Inuit peoples. But we are the world's 12th biggest economy, and we've got third world akin conditions, we've got socioeconomic deprivation, but we've also now got, from that situational trauma of socioeconomic deprivation, a sense of hopelessness, we've got various other trauma, we've got a constancy of trauma, multiple trauma, composite trauma, and often it degenerates into aggressive complex traumas. So we've got elevated risk groups that we need to further identify that actually have higher suicide rates than even the demographical suicide, the appalling, abominable suicide rates that I've described. And I've got to mention some of them. Some of them are the foster children. They could be as high as 3 and 4 times the demographical suicide rates of the Kimberley and far north Queensland. So we've got someone who in their form and content has been removed from their families. We need tailor-made responses and solutions to them. We need to identify these further, and also former inmates. You are 10 times more likely, all the research shows and the research of others, 10 times more likely to lose your life in the first year post-release than in any time while in prison from an unnatural death, suicide included.
Yeah, and the extraordinary thing is that those incarceration rates have actually been getting worse in recent years. Now, putting aside the call for a Royal Commission for a moment, what do you, because you've been working in this area for some time, what do you believe is at the heart of this issue? What is the key to turning this around?
Look, suicide is a pressing issue for all Australians. The Australian suicide toll has reached unprecedented levels. And, 1 in 4 of all suicides in the Australian suicide toll is actually of migrants, of people born overseas. Newly arrived migrants are also at risk. But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, there's a cesspool of drivers that are leading to this catastrophic humanitarian crisis, and it comes from that socioeconomic disadvantage. So we are not addressing the social determinants, and the social determinants actually vary vastly in terms of demography. And what we actually do need is to galvanise a type of extensive political reform to address that, and only a Royal Commission with its bevy of investigators and researchers, the likes that no other agency can put together in this nation, can address that. But we also need tailor-made responses and solutions. People need people. It can't just be done by technology, apps, and from a distance. They all play a contributing factor to work towards protective factors when you've got nothing else. But we need to actually tailor-make the responses to the various trauma that's actually out there to get people to a place of healing and well-being, so then they can navigate their various opportunities.
And Gerry, we had a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody a couple of decades ago. How successful was that, do you think? And why do we need a separate Royal Commission into an area that is probably pretty closely linked to that?
Well, there are multifactorial issues in both that are intertwined, and yes, some of that first Royal Commission, 87 to 92, translates to a lot of this, and we've got on the table a lot that can be drawn from, but it's actually nowhere near what needs to be examined, and there are vast other drivers or whatever that weren't actually covered in that first commission. The 338 recommendations that were endorsed out of the 339 recommendations from the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the majority of those have not been implemented, but they've been put on the table and drawn from. In the eastern seaboard, New South Wales and Victoria, we can actually argue that about 40% of those recommendations have been implemented and weighted in to some extent, including the custody notification service, which has actually saved lives in police watch houses, 15,000 detainees a year. That was a recommendation from that Royal Commission. The more west we go across the country, the less have been implemented, but we've extracted a dividend of social change agency from that Royal Commission that otherwise would not have been galvanised. Similarly so is what we need from this one, and we have to look at the constancy of traumas, the various traumas, and the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Deaths in Custody did not look at that. We are now 20 years down the track. Suicides are the pressing issue of our time. It is an indictment of this nation that we haven't shifted culturally to respond to that, and it's the education that we need, and only a Royal Commission, and the petition's actually addressed to both. We need a bipartisan, multi-partisan approach. We need both Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten to support the Royal Commission. There is no other way forward. We'll soak up a lot more blood, a lot more tragedy. But the most important thing, Joe, is that the families, and I have sat with hundreds of families across the nation of suicide-related trauma, they are also at an elevated risk group of losing another member of a family once you've lost one. They all want their stories told. They all want to be heard. This business that it's shame and taboo and that they don't want to speak to the issues and their sensitivities, it is not true. They're all pouring out their hearts. They need that outpouring through a Royal Commission, that psychosocial validation, that they are being heard. The silences are translating toxically as a disparity and racism. We've got to address that. Yeah,
there seems to be a lot of goodwill around this in the kind of discussion level. We'll see what happens with action. Gerry Georgatos, thanks so much for talking to us this morning from Perth.
Much respect, Joe.